Chata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshenu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. I tried to explain last week the motivation for establishing this year's shiur. And it was part of the introduction to Sefer HaChinuch, which is the book that we're going to be studying, the book of Mitzvah education. Okay. And I explained that basically, just very quickly, that the book was written in the 14th century, and it would appear that the author, based his material not only on the Gemara, but also based it particularly on legal decisions by Rambam and by the Rif. But what's important for us to understand is that Sefer HaChinuch is not a Sefer Psak. It's really not a book of legal decisions, as it is a tool, if I can use that term, to give us an understanding of how we go from the verse in the Torah to the halacha. Because the author basically implied each week people read a different parsha of the Torah and might wonder, well, what mitzvot are in that parsha? Okay? And even if we pick out a particular mitzvah in the parsha, let's take, for example, Parshat Bereshit, very first parsha, where most of us, I think, are familiar enough to know that Peru or Vu is the first mitzvah that's recorded. And the author bases it on the list of mitzvot, the 613 mitzvot, as determined by Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvot. So he's going to take that mitzvah and help us understand how we got from the pasuk, from the verse, to specifics about how that mitzvah is to be carried out. Who carries it out? When is it carried out? Under what circumstances? So these are the kinds of approach that I felt might be helpful for many of us, since we go to shul each week, or even if we're not in shul on Shabbos now during the pandemic, we may sit and read the Torah portion on our own. And naturally we can pick out certain mitzvot, but the question we might ask is, well, how does that apply? What's the circumstances? Okay? And so that was all a little bit part of last week's introduction. Then we started to look at that first mitzvah in Sedra Bereshit. So if you have a handout, now would be the time to look for it. Okay? I'm also using new technology here. So here we see, there it is. That's the text. I don't know if we can make it a little bit larger. I'm going to experiment there. There we go. A little larger still. Okay. Okay. So if we look down in this area of the page, you'll see that he cites the pasuk. Okay? God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply. Okay? Now, the implication that we're going to look at is, how does we go from that pasuk to so many halachas that basically deal with that issue of be fruitful and multiply? Where did he take these from? On what basis? One of the things I think that we're going to be a little surprised with, and as I said, we started this a little bit last week, is that he first of all wants to tell us what is the purpose of the mitzvah. Then, after he talks about the purpose of the mitzvah, he wants to explain under what circumstances the rules of the mitzvah apply. So if we go a little bit further down in the text, okay, to the next paragraph, we see it says basically he cites another verse, this time from Navi, from Isaiah, where he's telling us that the purpose of the creation of humanity is so that the world will be inhabited and not, right? And therefore that there be settlements, okay? This is an important mitzvah, he says, okay? Because Hashem wanted the world inhabited by human beings and not by angels. If that's the case, he's given us then what the purpose of the mitzvah is. So once we understand that, we can then ask ourselves the question, well, what are the parameters? Who observes the mitzvah, for example? Let's think of another question. Under what circumstances is the mitzvah of Peru or Vu supposed to be carried out? Right? Must it be only within the context of marriage, for example? Right? Is it only a mitzvah that's incumbent on men but not women, or is it incumbent on both? So he now goes into beginning in the next paragraph to start telling us some examples. Okay? The laws of this precept. Okay? So when he says the laws, what he's going to give us is a number of examples, clearly, okay? And as we talk about them, I'm going to point out, ideally, what some of the sources are that he has derived these laws from. Now, most of us would assume automatically that he derived it from the Talmud, okay? Perhaps the Babylonian Talmud, perhaps the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud. But what's interesting is the fact that unless we have an edition like this that has footnotes and tells us the sources, the author himself occasionally will tell us where he derives his sources. Sometimes he will even include the source itself, but not in the same format that it would appear in the Gemara, for example, or that it would appear in Rambam. And I'm going to give us that example shortly. So he says the first example, he says, of the law is when a man is duty bound to devote himself to it. What does it mean he's duty bound? Okay, well, the implication seems to be, what age does one have the obligation, for example, to perform the mitzvah of procreation, and under what circumstances? So our footnote would tell us that the following story in the Gemara, in the Babylonian Talmud Brachot 25, tells us the following story. Rav Achai arranged for his son to marry into the family of Rav Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta. He led him to enter the wedding canopy for the wedding ceremony, but he was unsuccessful in his attempts to consummate the marriage. Rav Achai followed him to examine possible causes of the problem, and he saw a Torah scroll placed there. Now remember, they did not usually have in the synagogue an ark at this time. They retained the Torah scrolls in a nearby home for safety. Okay? So what happens? He said to them, had I not come now, you would have endangered the life of my son, as it was taught in a Braita. In a room in which there is a Torah scroll or tefillin, it is forbidden to engage in conjugal relations until he takes them out of the room or places them in a vessel inside a second vessel. So first of all, the story tells us that the mitzvah of Priya and Rivya has to be within the context of marriage. Okay? That's the first, so to speak, aspect when a person can begin to fulfill that mitzvah. The second, however, also is the question of age, right? And so, okay, we have another story. This one we're more familiar with from Mishnah Avot, chapter 5. He used to say, a 5-year-old begins to study scripture. A 10-year-old begins Mishnah. A 13-year-old becomes obliged to observe the commandments. A 15-year-old begins the study of Gemara. And an 18-year-old goes to the marriage canopy. So if we take this source from Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers, we see it now tells us another area, that there's a certain age at which point there's the obligation to fulfill the mitzvah of Peru Urvu. Okay, so those are examples of how the author of Sefer HaChinuch is beginning to develop, okay, what the laws are. His second case, how many children he should have in order to have fulfilled it. For example, right? Again, what does it mean, how many children? Does it mean specific gender? Well, if we look at the Rambam, for example, in laws of Hilchot Ishut, laws of family life, we see in one chapter, he says, Kama banim yihiyu leish v'titkayem mitzvah zo biyado. Rambam asks, how many children? His answer, Zachar u'nekeva, a male and a female. Shene Amar, as it says, citing a verse, Zachar u'nekeva bira'am, male and female, he created them. Okay. Now, we might, of course, ask the question, okay, where did Rambam get that? On what basis does he see that as the minimum requirement that the author of Sefer HaChinuch, okay, while he does not spell it out, okay, does, however, hint at, okay, that if we were to look in the Gemara, in Yevamot, okay, we would find a Mishnah that tells us the following. Lo yivatel adam mipiria v'rivya. A man should not refrain from fulfilling the mitzvah of procreation, ela im kain yesh lo banim, unless he already has sons. Now, what does that mean? So the Mishnah goes on, Beit Shammai omrim shnei zecharim. So we come back now and says, im yesh lo banim may not mean the Mishnah sons, it may mean children. So how do we clarify that? So the Mishnah continues to show us there's a machloket, a difference of opinion between Beit Shammai, who says that it's 2 males, Beit Hillel, Omrim Zachar Unakeva. And Beit Hillel says male and female. Shene Amar, Zechar v'nekeva bara'am. The male and female, he created them. So the fact that Beit Hillel gives us not only a view of a child of each gender, but he also cites a pasuk to say that is the ideal minimum requirement, okay, to fulfilling the mitzvah. So we now understand, again, that even though the author of Sefer HaChinuch has not spelled that out, okay, that would be necessary to find elsewhere. He is telling us that that is the second area of law in terms of this general statement, this requirement. Let's take a look now, okay, again back in our text of Sefer HaChinuch, okay, and he's going to tell us, and from which mitzvot he is left free while occupied with this. Okay? The footnote tells us, we're not going to go into that one in detail, but again, from the Talmud we realize that a groom who is expected to consummate his marriage is exempt from Kriyat Shema. Okay? And so that again is an example. Okay. He continues in Sefer HaChinuch. Okay, and he points out where are these items coming from. He tells us from the Gemara, from Yevamot, from Brachot, okay, things like that. So the implication being, if you are interested, he's told you what these laws are, but if you want the details, you can either then look them up in the Gemara itself, or you go to a Sefer Psak, an actual book of law, and in his case, it would be the Rambam or the Rif. Okay. Next step, okay? He's told us what the purpose of the mitzvah is, Peru. He's told us some of the general concepts of laws connected with it. The third step he wants us to understand is when are we, or where are we expected to fulfill this mitzvah? Okay? Now, you might jokingly say, well, come on, Rabbi Greene, we all know where you fulfill that mitzvah physically. Okay? But the implication here is conceptual. Why? Because we all know that there are some mitzvot called mitzvot tluyot ba'aretz, some commandments that are specifically identified in terms of being able to be practiced only in the land of Israel, as opposed to other mitzvot which could be practiced outside the land of Israel as well. Let's take a quick example. Tithing, taking ma'aser, or certain other aspects of crops, clearly is limited to land of Israel. So here he tells us then, in this case, it remains in force in every place and every time. Why does he say every time? Because he wants us clearly to understand in this particular situation, okay, that it is a mitzvah that is expected to be carried out, okay, forever, if you will. Okay. Okay, let's go on now. But now he's going to still have to clarify an important example, okay? When he tells us in more detail, okay? And says, for this being the age, a man is obligated at the time he is suited. That's what we saw before. He cites the age, okay, at taking a wife, age 18. And then he makes an interesting statement that I think is important. This religious obligation is not imposed on women. Okay? So the mitzvah of Peru Urvu is only applied to men, it seems, and does not then seem to deal at all with women. Okay, so why is that significant? Well, let's think of a few examples. Number one, it's significant in the sense of it implies that men must be married, but it doesn't mean that women must be married. A second example, it implies in terms of the issue of birth control, that within a marriage or in certain circumstances, women may use birth control, but a man, it would imply, would not be able to use birth control. Right? So these are ramifications that therefore are going to come from his having highlighted that particular kind of situation. Now, he then wants to finish up his discussion of the circumcision. Okay. And I'm sorry, his discussion of Purvia Varivya, rule of Vu, by telling us anyone who fails to fulfill it in his life disobeys a positive commandment, a positive precept, and his punishment is very great. For he shows personally that he does not want to fulfill the wish of the eternal Lord to settle his will. So he finishes up his discussion of this mitzvah clearly with a message that one disobeys a mitzvah aseh, a positive commandment. And number two, it implies that not willing to fulfill divine command. So let's roll down now, okay, and go to our next example, okay? Okay, we'll go a little bit further, and we'll look at the next. In Parshas Noach, we don't have any mitzvot. We're not going to do, of course, every parsha, okay, but just selected ones. And so I thought perhaps, since we talked about Peru or Vu, the next one appropriate would be the next page, which deals with circumcision. So if we can try to...
Question.
Yes, go ahead.
In Noach, you have these 7 mitzvot b'nei Noach.
Right.
So Sefer HaChinuch just disregards those?
That's an excellent question. Okay. It would appear that he does. Now, the question we might ask is why? Okay. I can give you perhaps 2 possible suggested answers. One would be that those mitzvot, while we call them Sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach, the fact that we say that they're b'nei Noach, that they're more of on a universal basis and not given specifically to the Jewish people, okay, could be one reason that he does not discuss them. Okay? A more textual answer, the second possible answer, is that I indicated that, remember, he is basing his count of the 613 mitzvot specifically on the list derived by Rambam in his book, in the Sefer HaMitzvot. If we look to see in Rambam's Sefer HaMitzvot, are the Sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach listed there? No. Okay, so that would be a more direct, so to speak, textual answer. Okay? So I think in either case, the fact that he omits them, okay, is a sign that he does not see them as specifically applying to the Jewish people. Okay? Okay, I hope that satisfies your question. Right? Okay, thank you. Okay, we said now we're going to go to Sedra Lech Lecha, circumcision. Okay, now what's interesting is the author of Sefer Chinuch follows the same format in each case, okay? In each essay, let's call it, on the mitzvah. He wants us to understand, first of all, what is the pasuk, or the psukim, the Torah verses, or references in outside of the Torah and the prophetic books, the Navi, that are connected with this mitzvah. Secondly, okay, people are going to naturally ask, what's the purpose of the mitzvah? Okay? Now, we may consider that an interesting question in a sense, and we're going to get to it in a moment with circumcision, as to, aren't we, if it's a mitzvah, if it's something we commanded to do, why do we need an explanation? If it's a mitzvah, if it's commanded, shouldn't we just go right ahead and observe it without any questions, without any concern, without any doubts? But the author of Sefer Chinuch, remember, is, as part of his introduction, said one of the things he's concerned about is children. How will you explain to children what the mitzvah is of that week's parsha? He suggests, for example, at one point in the introduction, what if a youngster comes at the end of the Torah portion and asks, what's the mitzvah in this parsha? Or how many mitzvahs are in here? Or he suggests, perhaps it will encourage children, and not just children, adults as well, to pay closer attention to the Torah portion and to look for the mitzvah and ask themselves, well, if this is the mitzvah that's found here, what is the way to carry it out? How is it to be fulfilled? Okay. So I think the fact that after citing the pasuk or the psukim, the verses, okay, the fact that he goes into some explanation, okay, is very interesting, and the fact that it helps us understand that why, again, this book is an educational halachic text and not a sefer psak, and not a book of decisions. Okay? You don't find, if you look in Rambam, per se, you don't find him explaining a mitzvah. He tells you what it is. At times in Guide to the Perplexed, his other famous book, the Rambam will explain certain mitzvahs, and we're going to see, I think, an example of that as we look at the mitzvah of Brit Milah in a moment or two. That may be the case. All right? Okay. Again, after he does the explanation, the purpose, he goes into some of the reasons and then some of the specific laws associated with the particular mitzvah. Okay? So let's start off. Our second topic is circumcision. Okay. Again, I'm primarily focusing using the English text because I think that's a little bit easier to follow and delineate. Okay. He starts off, we said, with the mitzvah of circumcision. What's the pasuk? Okay, again, right? This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. Okay? So here's our verse that tells us, number one, male must be circumcised. Number two, it has to be done. However, if we only, let's say, relied on that one pasuk, it would never tell us, number one, at what age. Number two, it would never tell us, okay, what's to be done. Number three, it would not give us an answer as to who is to do it. All of these issues. Okay? So he cites a second pasuk, right? This coming from Sedra Tazria, later in the Torah. And on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. Okay? So at least this pasuk now gives us a date when this event is to take place. But in doing so, it seems natural to want to ask the question, why do we need two psukim? Right? Wouldn't it have been enough had the Torah just given it in one and give us the specifics, right, that we need? And so he has to respond to that natural question and tell us, many precepts, many mitzvot are similarly repeated in numerous places in the Torah, and all for a necessary purpose, as our sages of blessed memory explained them. Okay? So he cites, there's in our text a footnote there, okay? And there's a specific, which we're not going to look at in detail, a Gemara in Shabbos, in the Bavli, that talks about circumcision, okay, particularly under certain unique circumstances. Let's say the individual is sara'at, he has leprosy on his organ. Do you still do the circumcision or not? And in the course of that kind of a topic, okay, there is additional information about the practice of circumcision. Okay? Having said that, excuse me, he wants us now to understand, we said the next step, citing pasuk, then step two, what is the purpose, okay, of this mitzvah. However, it may be surprising a little bit to see that here he gives an extended explanation. Okay? Why is that necessary? Okay? I'm going to suggest that it was necessary because people, certainly in those times, okay, when Abraham, okay, and others began the practice of circumcision, it was not common. In fact, we know in later periods, not only was it not a common practice, but Romans even outlawed the practice, thinking that it was unnatural, okay? That it was an attack almost on the human body. So what he does here is basically he's going to give us an explanation in a moment, okay, of this text as to what the methodology, if you will, okay? How is it to be carried out, okay? And that's what he does in the next paragraph. But what's important, I felt, for us to understand is why did he have to do this? He's basing it, as we understand, on a statement from Rambam again, but not this time a halachic statement in the Mishnah, Torah, but rather, if you will, a more theological statement found from Rambam in Guide to the Perplexed. Okay? The concept being that, in essence, the circumcision of Abraham made him a more perfect person. And I'm going to share part of that piece from Rambam, from the guide at this point. In trying to explain the purpose of circumcision, Rambam writes as follows. He gives what we might call the classical explanation. And then he says, there is, however, another important object in this commandment. It gives to all members of the same faith, i.e., to all believers in the unity of God, a common bodily sign, so that it is impossible for anyone that is a stranger to say that he belongs to them. For sometimes people say so for the purpose of obtaining some advantage or in order to make some attack upon the Jews. No one, however, should circumcise himself or his son for any other reason but pure faith. For circumcision is not a mere incision on the leg or a burning in the arm, but a very difficult operation. It is also a fact that there is much mutual love and assistance among people that are united by the same sign when they consider it a symbol of a covenant. Circumcision is likewise the symbol of the covenant which Abraham made in connection with the belief in God's unity. So also everyone that is circumcised enters the covenant of Abraham to believe in the unity of God in accordance with the words of the law. This purpose of the circumcision is as important as the first, and perhaps more important. So we see that taking the, if you will, the model of Rambam there, the author of Sefer HaChinuch has decided that he also needed to go into some more detailed explanation. Okay? And as I said, in our text, what he does is he simply reviews what the procedure of the operation is. Okay? He's now going to then go into the reasons. We just shared, in a sense, part of that from his example, right? To the guide to the perplexed. Okay? And what we'll do is, at this point, I just want us to go down to the third paragraph, the last paragraph on the page. Okay? And I want us to understand that, again, he refers to the issue as part of that explanation is why is it that circumcision takes place where it does? Okay? And he has an answer for that too. Namely, that it's the causal source of the existence of the human species. Okay? That in essence, in other words, that is the organ of procreation. Okay? And therefore, he points us out in more detail. He wished that this perfection be effected by man. He did not create him complete and perfect from the womb in order to hint to him that just as the perfection of his physical form is by his own hand, so does it lie in his hand. In other words, his means and power to complete his spiritual form by the worthiness of his actions. So the author here, therefore, tells us the same way we can complete and improve ourselves physically, so we can improve ourselves spiritually. And that's in our power. So we're going to stop there for today. I thank you all for joining and participating. Okay, wish you all stay well and stay